All right, so AP, this is our last unit all together. We're going to come put all this chapter and the next chapter together, which is the first one is about life in the 18th century, which is the 1700s, and the other one is the actual French Revolution. And so we're going to kind of put this together as kind of this is what led to the French Revolution, and this is what was happening in other places while the French Revolution is happening. So, because not everything is the same. So, what we're talking about here is the early 18th century, the proto-industrial revolution is where we're starting. So, kind of getting into this whole thing is that we had this kind of global change happening climatically that from 1350 to 1700, there was this mini ice age. There's a fluctuation of just a few degrees, as you can see here, which then led to changes politically, economically, and especially in the agricultural system, that you're going to see fluctuations that basically led to them not being able to feed themselves, and then all of a sudden this is going to kind of come to an end as we come out of the 1700s, and we're going to see a need for a change in how they do things. So basically, life before the proto-industrial revolution, which is an agricultural revolution, is what it really is, that society really hadn't changed much since the time of the Romans, really. That 80% of the population, and just like you saw in the early United States, that huge amounts of the population were agrarian, and now it's going to shift. So it was 80% in Western Europe, even higher in Eastern Europe, and that's going to continue all the way into the 20th century. And they basically operated under the same medieval concepts. Everything was done by hand. There was some animal power, but not much. They used an open field system where basically you had these open areas that you would then just sow your seed and hope something happened. And this led to large amounts of crop failures and not being able to sustain the population. You have to remember, Europeans are mostly eating bread. All right, it's a wheat. And that's just the little top of the plant, not the whole plant. Or in the case of Native Americans, that had a very diversified diet where they're eating things like potatoes and eating things like corn and things like that. The Europeans, they were very stuck on this grain, that was a weed that was really hard to harvest. It was hard to grow, and it also had limited calorie intake. So there's going to be huge changes. Okay, so this idea of they would rotate the land, as you can see here. This is this open field system that basically you would put, this was where you put the animals and let this land set. And so you'd let things break back down. Then you'd have fields. So there's kind of a form of crop rotation, but you're leaving large amounts of the field not being used. And they had common pastoral lands, which allowed for everyone to put their animals into areas and graze. But it's not very efficient. So, and then on top of it, these people are highly taxed. They're used as grunt labor in everything they want, that these upper class nobility want. And so you have limited land usage. Then on top of it, the burden of high taxation, then the burden on top of that of crop failures, and the fact they're using these medieval systems is what was basically crippling them economically. And so this is your 17th century agrarian society. Very few animal usage. It's hand labor, and it's not easy, and it's not very efficient. So then what we're going to see is in places like England, the Netherlands, and then France later, you're going to see this movement towards an industrialization of the agrarian society. So we're going to increase production of food. We're going to see new methods of cultivation. And we're also going to see the ideas of animal husbandry, where you're going to breed certain animals to get a better animal, which then increases the amount of food production and theoretically the amount of wealth. This is that shift we're going to see from what we call the nobility to the landed gentry, people who could actually make money off of farming. And so in England, and this is the thing, why does it start in England? It's the same reason the actual Industrial Revolution, the main Industrial Revolution of the 1800s takes place, is that England's an island. It's desperate for resources. And so it has to find, with limited areas, it's going to have to find ways to use that land efficiently. Same way with the Netherlands. Limited land, but also these are very merchant class societies. These are societies that are moving towards the ideas of capitalism. So where you can use technology to be more efficient, to make more profit, they're going to be supported. They're more open societies also. One's a republic, the other's a constitutional monarch. So the type of government they have, the fact that they are merchant class societies, and the fact that they need to do this, that they have limited resources, being a small country below sea level, or in the case of England, being an island, they have to use what they have efficiently. And so that's what's going to feed this. So some of the people we're going to talk about, one is Townshend. Charles Townshend, basically, he figured out the concept of crop rotation, that if you plant turnips one year, and you harvest the turnips, which, by the way, are also a long, stable crop that you can basically store these things for a period of time. The tops of the turnip can be put back into the ground. They can be used for livestock, for feed, or they can also be used for nitrogen as these things break down and replenish the soil. He's also going to promote the idea of using manure to fertilize fields, which means that instead of having this 3-field system where one field is left empty, you now could theoretically farm all the fields at once. Jethro Tull, who's not just a member of the band, it's a joke for someone, is going to basically apply the ideas of the scientific revolution and create this thing called the seed drill, which then allows, instead of how it used to be done was you'd have older people do the Dopplers. They'd take these sticks and they'd stick them in the ground and make a hole, and little kids would come along and put the seed in the ground and cover them up. So imagine how far you could go by hand, sticking canes in the ground to put seeds in, or just walking along and sowing seed. And then you would have little kids run around the fields all day, basically trying to keep the birds from eating the seeds until they started growing. Well, now you could, not only could this plant them, but it could cover the seeds also. So instead of planting one little area, you could plant a large area. Now, granted, it was still hand pulled, but eventually, larger versions of this are going to be coupled with animals. You're going to see a scientific method, like we said, scientific method applied to all areas of science. And that was the idea that we're applying the ideas of capitalism as well. Robert Bakewell is going to use the ideas of animal husbandry on livestock, which then created larger animals, which like horses, dogs. And that's the other thing. The horse was not widely used in farming by peasants because the amount of leather and the amount of technique it took to make a harness, because horses are different than cows. You can just put a yoke on a cow because of the way they're structured. But with a horse, it has to have a special harness, which takes more machining, which takes more leather work. And so what happens is by growing these larger animals, and you have more leather, and because you have merchant classes that now are working in the ideas of industrialization, you can create these harnesses that allow animals like horses to be used. So you can see the massive increase. Look at England. I mean, and you can see if Eastern Europe is this lower level here. Notice how it never seems to go. Same with Central Europe. These are those heavily agrarian serf areas. So this is the kind of thing that would show up on the AP test, is this right here. It shows that these areas are declining or struggling, but that's that forced serfdom, the lack of industrial growth. France, well, you can see part of the problem in France here is the French Revolution, and then it goes up. This is the beginning of the French Revolution, and then it's going to drop off because of the Napoleonic Wars. But look at England. That industrialization that's taking place. So the chart tells you the problems in Eastern and Central Europe, the lack of organization, the constant warfare, and the forced serfdom. That why would I move? It's kind of like when you think about in U.S. history, the idea of slavery, that everyone talks that slavery was a dying thing. Then why didn't it die? Well, because it's hard to shift a society away from what it knows, and that it also causes a social class movement, that these plantation owners in the South, there was no desire to move because it worked for them. they were the ones benefiting from it. So why would they change the system? Same way with nobles in Eastern Europe. Why would you move away from serfdom towards industrialization when you're the one making the money off of it? There's no need to change it. Whereas in England, this landed gentry, Mr. Darcy, not Lord Darcy, can see that the industrialization is going to, of agriculture is going to actually benefit him, and he's going to promote these ideas. And so you're also going to see a shift. This also ties into the age of exploration, is that you're going to have new foods come in from the Columbian Exchange, like corn and potatoes. And potatoes, we're going to read next semester, have a major impact on European society, which increases the amount of calories, which increases the amount of people. You're also going to see a beginning of what we call the enclosure movement. Before, it was common land, where people would plant and put their animals in common areas. Well, that's going to end when we get into the 17th century, and then eventually into the 18th century, is that we're going to enclose these lands, which also then creates a new social class, that the landed gentry could portion out the land, enclose it by building fences or hedge lines, and that was their land. Now, it worked well, and because it increased the profit for things like wool and cattle, because you could keep them in a smaller area, keep them fed well. It also increased crop prices because less crop is being damaged by animals moving in and out of field areas. But it also hurt lower class, because when they portion these out, you could be, notice this guy here with the blue, right? He's cut off in these little areas, and he also doesn't have access to waterways. This is probably, except for right here, right? This is probably a poorer person. These are the lower class fields. So it helped the wealthy in that they could then portion out their land, increase production, and show their wealth. However, when you get these portions that are cut off, that are hard to get to or access, those are usually given to the or were portioned out to the lower classes, and that usually hurt them economically. But it does increase the power of the landed gentry, which then increases their power in things like parliament. So you're seeing this shift again away from nobility as you had increased the middle-sized farms, and then parliament is going to push, like we said, the Enclosure Act in the 18th century, which basically it benefited large landowners, which were no longer the nobles for the most part. We're seeing this beginning of, like I said, the landed gentry, that upper, not middle class, but upper middle, lower upper class that aren't landed with titles. These are people who purchased their land or people who earned their land and weren't given it. And so they become more powerful, and that's going to keep even more a shift into the power of the House of Commons. So it's a political thing, it's an economic thing, it's also a social thing, as we see a beginning of a large middle class growing in power, but we also see a decline of the lower class. And this is that enclosure movement. In England, because it's so rocky, these are made out of rock. And this is the thing you had children do. So this is in England. In France, they're going to use hedges, which pose a big problem when we get to World War II. Another thing that benefited the landowners, since they had the power in the House of Commons, and like I said, this is that upper middle class, that very high class, right? But they're not nobles. They're going to pass a thing called the Corn Laws. And what it basically did was, and you're going to see an end to mercantilism, because obviously these landed gentry are not going to be overly thrilled with the ideas of mercantilism. And we're going to see a movement towards where the government promotes trade internally. So basically, it's a tariff on grain being imported in. All right. So then the landed gentry would make more money off of their food that they're producing, because it's keeping cheaper food from like Eastern Europe or from the continent from getting into England. Well, it's a great thing for the upper class, but it artificially increases the expenditures of the lower classes, because money then is, well, food is inflated in price, and so therefore they can't purchase it as easily. This is going to be a major problem in the 1840s in Ireland, that you had the potato famine where you could have moved in really cheap food and saved millions of people, but the Corn Laws are going to prevent that from happening. So it's an artificial way of increasing the wealth of this upper class while at the same time hurting the lower classes. If you get rid of the Corn Laws, theoretically, it would benefit them, like the lower class. It would increase their wages without actually increasing their wages. So Now, for women, the enclosure movement has a major impact because before this, women were, and this is, you have to understand how this works, is that women worked in what we call the putting out system or the cottage industries. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So because really women were very important in the weaving. So this was a major problem for the peasantry. They're forced off land, they're given crappy land, but at the same time, by enclosing it, you're pushing them into the cities, which then increase the labor force in the cities, which leads to the Industrial Revolution. See how that works? Is it actually hurt them in the countryside? So peasants being forced off their land by the enclosure movement end up in the cities, and then they end up the cheap labor that then feeds the Industrial Revolution that's coming in England first. So, and so we're seeing this shift away from the rural peasantry and the aristocracy elites in many places, but there were still some very traditional kind of roles to this. So, and and again, we're going to see this idea of serfdom throughout Europe. In Eastern Europe, in England, basically serfdom is over. In Russia, the Habsburgs, this idea of the compulsory service, the robot, is still there, which is kind of sort of slavery. In France, they're going to have the corvée, which is basically forced labor for a short period of time, all the way up until the French Revolution. And the Ottoman Empire and the Russians still have serfdom. There are going to be rebellions. We talked about the Pugachev Rebellion that took place in 1773 in Russia, put down by Catherine the Great. There will also be other uprisings in Bohemia, Transylvania, Moldavia, Austria. In Western Europe, though, there aren't any revolts for the simple fact that you could leave, right? There are riots over prices and stuff, but there's not that social class thing there anymore that keeps it in place. About 1% to 5% of the aristocracy, this idea of the upper social class, they have the political power and that during this time. We're going to see a movement away from nobility, though, in England, right? That the nobles controlled some leverage, some power still in the House of Lords, but not in the House of Commons, in French parliaments. But this is the shift, is that England had the smallest, wealthiest, but best defined. Like, you know exactly who they are. Okay, but there's only 400 families. Sorry. There we go. There's only 400 families, but they only own about a quarter of the land. So they still have some legal privileges in that. And they did have some very large political power, the aristocracy and the nobility did in England. But that's fading as the landed gentry come in, and eventually the House of Commons becomes the power. In France, it's a free-for-all. There's 400,000 nobles because the nobles of swords, you earned it, but the nobles of robe could buy it. And then that allowed them special privileges and actually a pension that they could then pass on to their children. So it was a way the king was actually making money off this. The king in England is actually making money by doing it the old-fashioned way. He's investing it, all right? In Eastern Europe, it's all tied to military traditions. It's serfdom, nobility, inherited, and of course there's this large amount of serfdom. So there's that hierarchical structure that's taking place in Europe. And how you kept it in place is that the upper class would put in game laws, which then would keep the middle class from coming out and hunting on their lands. And since it was kind of it hurt the lower class, the game laws, because obviously they couldn't hunt for food. But it was also a dig at the middle class. Like, you have to understand, social class in England is extremely well structured. The nobility have their place, their lord blah, blah, blah. Then there's Mr. blah, blah, blah. And then below it is the townspeople. Then below it would be the peasantry, the farmers. And so the game laws were basically a way of keeping you in your place, that you knew where you belong, because you can't come hunt on my land, even though you've got all this land because you're landed gentry, or because you are working in a factory now, you own a factory and have all kinds of money. You still have to obey the game laws that kept you in place, that kept you in check. You're going to see a lot of movement during this time period. We'll talk more about that later. And then the impact of this is the cottage industry. Okay, there's going to be a huge population explosion during this time period, but there is going to be an impact as far as women, which we're going to talk about. So there's new foods, new population growth. Um, so this is our population increase. Notice by 1850 over 260 million. There's your high concentration of population. Areas like this, there's a lot of warfare in that took place. And this is a lot of space. This is a high concentration. Especially look at France. This is part of the thing that's going to cause the French Revolution, is this high concentration of people. And there's your beginning of urbanization. Look at London and Paris. That explains a lot. Then you look at places like Warsaw, Vienna, right? This is your industrial base that you're going to see, especially in England. And your industry and population. And so in cities, you're going to see a massive growth in cities during this time period. That you're going to see urban classes, the upper class nobility still there, large merchants, bankers, financiers. Then you're going to see the beginning of what we call the bourgeoisie, which is the merchant trader people, the tradesmen, like the craftsmen, the craft guilds, the bankers, the professionals. They're very diverse and divided. Normally, they support reforms that help them, but they tend to be also very conservative, and they really don't like the poor. You're going to see this over and over, especially in the next unit or next semester, okay, is that the bourgeois, the middle class, really the reason they don't fear the upper class, they fear the lower class. And the upper class are the ones who basically run the city, right? They're the officials that run the cities. Then, of course, you have the artisans, which are going to be what will later become the petit bourgeois, which are most of you. They're the butchers, the fishmongers, the carpenters. They're the largest growing population. They tend to be also very conservative in their views, but this upper middle class and this lower middle class definitely have a problem with the poor. And we're going to see how they go along with many laws to keep these people in check. We see some food rights in that. We're talking about going into the next generations. And we'll talk more about Jews, too, that they're still seen as outsiders. They're pushed into what we call ghettos. So they're isolated culturally and socially. And they're not really given the same social status or rights as other people in society in most of Europe. And that's your population rates. And then this is the big thing. This is where we make the shift. Is one of the things that really affected because by the agricultural revolution, this proto-industrial revolution. That's why they call it proto. It's the beginning of the before, right? Is that we used to have a cottage industry that everything was produced, like wool and clothing and things like that, were basically produced in homes, and so you could start your own family at a very young age. If you one side would give you the sheep and the land, the other side would give you a spinning wheel and a loom, and then you would build the house together. And then you and your wife, your young 20-something wife, all they had to do is basically produce the labor force with the children. The boys would go out and work the fields and tend to the sheep. The girls would tend to the younger children and would actually work on the looms and produce. So between the fields and the sheep, you could then produce textiles and food that you could then sell and support your family. So men and women during this time period in the cottage industry were really kind of partners with each other. And so this is that cottage industry. So it's basically a family enterprise. And older women, this was a way older women could also support themselves in that they could spin the extra thread that you had, extra wool and spinning, and that's where the term spinster came from, is that women who didn't have husbands could still earn enough money to survive or could trade their labor for, like, if you needed your roof fixed or, if you needed a new chair, you could trade your skill as a spinner then to do this. And so this was a way families in rural populations then could support themselves. So this is how it worked. So you take the raw wool and then you'd spin it, dye it, it'd go to the clothier, and then it'd go to the wool market, which they could sell. This is that putting out system. And so here it is in the home. You have your loom. So you'd work the fields, and then at home, the wife and the daughters would, and you just produce your labor force. And so the advantage to this was it gave them, the rural populations, a higher wage, and they could earn. The quality of goods were better too, because they obviously could produce, small amounts, which then are better quality goods. The problem is the merchants then had to pay large amounts for that, which then inflated the price of goods and could not be sold cheaply. So so it was a great way for the rural populations to support themselves. The problem is the merchants and the capitalists, though, this is basically hurting them, and they want to find a cheaper, faster way to do it. How do you do that? And like we said, it interferes with the capitalist ideas. So how do you do this? You move away from it. You move away from this, and it's flourishing during the first part in England. But then, and like we said, it supplemented their pay. But it created unregularity in population and in goods. You could, all these things are being produced in homes. They could also produce silverware. They could produce goods. I mean, a lot of things are being produced besides wool. They could produce different materials at home, which then could be shipped into the cities to be traded. But they're small amounts, which means they're very expensive. They last a long time, but they're very expensive. And that's not going to change with this guy. John Kay creates what they call the flying shuttle, which reduced the amount of time. It's basically a power loom that the loom then can operate with less labor. Then you get James Hargreaves creates the spinning jenny. So instead of one spinning wheel, you have multiple spinning wheels happening at the same time. So instead of having one person do it, you could have this machine that could do it. So we're shifting away from manpower to machine power. And then the big change is how do you power this? Is Arkwright creates this thing called the water frame. Well, he actually didn't create it. He stole the idea. He and Kay were partners. He got some people drunk and they stole the idea. And Arkwright, by the time they got through the courts, Arkwright's name was already on it. And so he gets the credit for it. Arkwright basically is creating a device that then allows water to push a wheel, which then turns the gears, which operates the machines. So you move from manpower to animal power to now water power, which means you could put massive amounts of these spinning machines all together. And then by the 1780s, we're going to use its steam, which means the factory could basically be anywhere you pop water to it, it can operate. Eli Whitney created cotton gin. Not only does that, it interchangeable parts, which is key to the factory system, but the cotton gin means you're going to move away from wool to cotton. Cotton is cheaper, it's lighter, it can be spun quicker, it's renewable, it takes up less space as far as like sheep, and less manpower, unless you're using slave. Well, it uses less manpower once you're separating it because you don't have to share the sheep and everything. But obviously to pick it takes a lot of manpower, which leads to slavery. So that's a whole different issue. All right. Then Samuel Crompton invented the spinning mule, which combined all these things together with a water frame to make it even faster. And notice the growth of foreign trade that's going to take off in England. All right. The impact, though, is that women had this significant place in the economy, that by being loom operators or spinners, and by the family being the shared family group, women then are forced out of that position, that they don't need your wool produced in the homes anymore. So you're going to see a displacement of women in society, economically and socially. You're also going to see these women being pushed out being pushed into the industrial revolution that's coming. It also, because of the loom and the spinning, women became identified with the home all the time. This is Rousseau's idea that women, that separate spheres thing, is that men go outside the house and women work inside. And that creates that idea of the home and mother concept. And we already saw that beginning with the Renaissance. And then on top of it, men's pay totally outstrips women. That basically, once you got machines doing it, they're like, well, I don't need women to do it. And they pay them less. So economically, socially, this hurt women a lot. It also hurt rural populations. And that as you were basically forcing families into the Industrial Revolution. Between the enclosure movement and the shutting down the cottage industry, it forces more and more rural families into urban populations. In Western Europe, you're going to see a lot more of what we call the nuclear family, where it's married couple, children, usually children through their teens before you went off and got married and settled down. The average age of marriage is about 26 for men, 23 for women. But remember, that's younger, older. Servants are going to see a lot more of servant use as you get upper class coming in. Family structures in Eastern Europe, however, are going to be extended families. They're going to be multiple families together in one area, and they typically live close to each other in rural areas because it increased labor. So, but yeah, there's this shift as we're talking about. Then wrapping this up, there's this shift economically, politically, in that you're moving from a rural population to an urban population and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And they're also, that's going to have political impacts, that you're going to see a decline of the, even though they have a lot of power, the nobility is going to start declining in favor of this landed gentry. However, in France, there's a whole mess happening there, that you got a combination. It's like you got a little bit of everything combined there. So, and this is why England ends up becoming a major political power. It's shifting economically towards an industrial revolution. All right, that's all for this one.